Okay, so hello everyone. Today we are looking at specifically this particular chapter, which is chapter 3, Rise of Japanese Militarism. Okay, so let's recap. I think you would already know the map of Japan, all right? And this is an example of how it does show that Japan is an island country, all right? Definitely the neighbors are China, Korea. These are the important specific geographical aspects of Japan. Okay, and if you compare Japan in terms of land mass to the rest of the world, Japan is of substantial size, right? But however, when we look at Japan's history specifically, how Japan went um, and fight the war with China, or when Japan tried to conquer the rest of Southeast Asia, as well as later on the war with America. So I want you to put that in perspective. So specific skills that you need to know for your national exams will be this, all right? It is the same as what we went through when we went through Hitler, all right? Now, demonstrate awareness of political developments after World War One. You know, how things that happened in World War One, how they affected Japan, examine the rise of the regimes. Okay, and we are looking at the impact of Japan, whether it's political, economic, and social. And specifically for Japan, I would say there isn't a key player, unlike Hitler, when we talk about Germany. But what is it that when we talk about the rise of Japan militarism specifically, are there things that we need to look at and how they established authoritarian rule? So these are key concepts. Again, key concepts are pretty similar because we are talking about rise of authoritarian regimes. All right. Nationalism plays a very big part in Japan's history because we are talking about why is it there is a rise of Japanese militarism. Okay. How about the other aspects of governance? All right. Was there democracy in Japan? We talk about militarism. Okay, and why prior to World War II, why were the people very accepting, very open to having a very militaristic Japan? All right, and what happened to parliamentary or democratic form of government? What happened in Japan will then spiral into what happens, or how, for example, Japan's militarism or military instinct rose to power. So this is the big overview of this topic, and specifically in the national exams, you will be asked why. All right, there was the rise and establishment of the authoritarian regime. So there are three reasons: weakness of the democratic government in Japan, economic challenges, and I've sort of divided into four economic challenges, appeal of ultra-nationalist faction. So this is a new sort of term. All right, what is the ultra-nationalist faction? Right, and in this ultra-nationalist faction, there is subpoints. Okay, the appeal, was it because of military success or was it because of political assassination? So this is number one, A, B, and C. Actually, A, B, and C will actually be one factor here. All right, and then of course you have the second part of this particular essay or particular overview. It would be definitely what is the increased influence, what is the impact of militarists in Japan? Okay, how they consolidate power, political power, what were the economic policies, what were the social policies, and what was the impact to the people. So a bit of introduction. All right. So specifically from the 1600s all the way to the 1800s, Japan was ruled by the emperor. However, there is always a shogunate, okay, or what we call a military government that is led by the shogun, which is the military leader. Now, by right, the shogun's authority was very limited because you do have the emperor, and the shogun is supposed to report to the emperor. So there's many shoguns, there's many military leader, right? To simplify this. Now, over time, of course, the shogun grew very not only popular but also very powerful, and they became the real ruler of Japan, whereas the emperor unfortunately became a figurehead. So do take note of Japan. Japan is definitely very hierarchical. You have the emperor by right, top of the Japanese society, but had little real power. And then you have the daimyo, which is the wealthy landowners, and they also have specifically the shogun. Now you have the samurais, all right, and then you have the peasants and artisans, and the lower class were the merchants because they were seen as not producing anything but selling. So this is the hierarchy of Japanese society. And specifically under the shogun's rule, Japan was definitely an agrarian society, a lot of crops, right? So they're very much an agriculture sort of country. Okay, and during that time as well, Japan was very much isolated. There were foreigners, but very few could enter into the country. Now, in 1868, unfortunately, the shogun, the military leader, lost his power, and Emperor Meiji here on the right took control of the government. So he was one of the few people that led a battle, and he won. Now, during this period, we call it the Meiji Restoration. All right, Japan began to modernize. So you can see in this picture the way that Meiji, the emperor, was wearing very much very Western. Okay, and it experienced what we call a lot of changes, and because the world was changing, and the Japanese wanted to be part of the world or the world power. All right. Now, what is the impact of the Meiji Empire? Politically, they came up with a new constitution. All right. The emperor remains the head of state, but also had to rule according to a set of laws. All right. So you can see that there was this transferring of trying to be sort of semi-Western here. All right. The emperor also had to share power with the government, and it was okay if the emperor was well respected, like Emperor Meiji, and there was political stability. But it would change if the emperor was weak and people could manipulate the emperor. Now, economically, Japan's economy and military was strengthened. There were a lot of policies to modernize Japan. So this is a time where I told you about modernization, right? They went to learn in US or in Europe. They wanted to see how big societies, big countries, big powers run their government. And they even came up with a motto: enrich country, strengthen army. There was a lot of industrialization, there was banking system, and this was the beginning of the Zaibatsus, which were large cooperations, and they were opening up Japan to engage in foreign trade, exporting of goods to the world. So Japan has technically entered, I would say, the global world during this time. Now, in terms of social, you could see that the cities grew, the population rose, and there was a difference in terms of how society is, because you can see that the samurai is no longer the elite, and the army was the ones that were replacing the samurais, and they were opening up and trying to sort of follow how Westerns were. So they had vocation schools. They were very much into nationalist feelings, but they were still having a lot of Japanese loyalty. And a lot of the curriculum was really centered on making sure that the people are still loyal, despite them being trying to be very modern. Now, in or during, I would say, Meiji period, there was a lot of progress specifically for Japan. All right. Because they saw that Japan had very limited resources, even though they were exploring the world, you would see that Japan is predominantly an agrarian society. And in terms of the population that's increasing, they need to expand. Right. And I told you before that because of their location and where they are, and they're very close to China, and at that time, China was unfortunately very weak. So Japan, being a modernized country now, learning that, okay, I'm powerful and I am able to test my soldiers and my army and my military. So they won the first, I would say, war against China in 1894. It is the Sino-Jap War. And in 1904, what was interesting that they went against Russia, which was a Western power. So people were expecting that Japan would lose. But because the Japanese were really much more stronger than the Russians, they actually won. And the fact that they learned how to modernize their army and they had very good, well-trained soldiers, all this allowed them to gain certain land. So that is why later on you realize that, hey, why is Korea under Japan? Because, as part of the treaty, right, Russia had to give up certain parts of land. So parts of it were like Korea, Taiwan, the Lidong Peninsula and Manchuria, and it gave this Japanese a boost of confidence. All right, so you have a country that is just starting to blossom, and they were able to defeat two big countries. Who would expect, right? So it really made them a bit more confident. All right, so an example of the Russo-Japanese War as well as the Sino-Jap War. Now, impact. All right. The economy expanded. It gave the leaders the confidence that Japan right now has a place in international politics. Now, I do want you to focus on this. I think we need to understand how the structure of the state is. So, like we said just now, the emperor is definitely the head of state. Okay. Now, in the diet or the parliament, you have the privy council. Okay, consists of powerful officials appointed by the emperor and answerable only to the emperor. Okay, you have the general, elderly statesmen, the key players in the Meiji Restoration. Again, they are special advisors with the authority to choose the prime minister. All right. And it was an informal part of the Japanese political structure. So they were elders, they were very important people, and they were also the ones that advised both the emperor as well as the cabinet. Now you have the military, both army and navy. He had what we call a disproportionate influence over the cabinet because it cannot be formed without a minister from the military. However, the emperor commanded the military. So the military is very interesting because you cannot be formed without having someone who backs you up. Okay, but the military is able to veto decisions made by the cabinet. Now, who makes up the cabinet? The prime minister, okay, and all the different ministries, and the minister of the army and minister for the navy. They don't report to the cabinet. They actually report directly to the emperor. Now, the cabinet runs by prime ministers, and all these other ministers led the diet, which was civilian politicians, and there were many, many, many different. Sometimes this could be a coalition because there is many different political parties, right? And it also is made up of house of peers, usually the elites. So a bit complicated because the emperor controls certain groups of people, and the military is powerful, the privy council is powerful, the cabinet seems to be the sandwiched between the emperor and all these important figures, and they are the ones who will lead the other civilian politicians. Now, how then did the Japanese continue its rise? And then we will look at the impact of it in political, economic, as well as social. Now, one of the many reasons why Japan became more militaristic was because of three reasons: political, economic, as well as the social, this appeal of ultranationalists. So one of the things that happen is, like I mentioned, if you have a very weak emperor, okay, then it is very hard for the emperor to control everyone. They end up advising him a lot of things, but the emperor seems to be unable to make the decision. Okay, so the emperor was sickly at that time, and previously there was a lot of politicians who had retired. Remember when we talk about this, the generals, all right, a lot of them had retired, and they couldn't sort of help the emperor get its stand or get its power. Now, the military, however, opposed international policy of diplomacy or trade. They just wanted to make sure that they get the real deal. Now, it is very upsetting for the military when their budget is being cut. Okay, and at times the military refused to supply ministers for the army and navy, and because of that, the cabinet can't really form. Remember, I was telling you that this you need to have a minister in the cabinet, because if not, then it's very hard. Then you don't have a full cabinet. You don't have the minister of, or maybe minister of foreign affairs or minister of war, something like that. So you don't have that. So it becomes a very incomplete cabinet. So it feels as though the military runs by itself. Okay. Now, for a new law to be passed, the prime minister needs to gain majority support. However, if the Diet was a coalition government, it is very hard. Remember, coalition governments are always the hardest. Now, the prime minister had to consider the interests of the, the private council, a lot of the times, and military leaders were officially appointed by emperor, and they had no authority to remove any military officials who disobeyed the policies. So this caused division, and eventually, as the military gets stronger, they bypassed even the emperor, or they even bypassed the prime minister. Now let's look at economically. So while Japan, has been actually been progressing, and they have been quite successful, standard of living is way better, it tends to swing from periods of boom to periods of recession. So beginning was good, all right, beginning was good, but there was this unfortunate incident, which was the earthquake, and it actually shook both Tokyo as well as Yokohama. There is a video, you can watch it. And you can see that starting from 1920s, 1923, 1927, and 1929, Japan was was in a dilemma, an economic dilemma specifically. So you had the banking crisis, you had the Wall Street crash, and then you had the Great Depression. And all of this led to severe inflation. The prices of goods were really, really high. Unemployment, obviously. And because the rest of the world couldn't buy Japanese goods, it was really hard for Japan to sell. And a lot of business owners closed down, and it led to even more unemployment. All right. And because of the economic challenges, such as these four challenges, it led to the rise of militarism, because it felt as though the civilian government could not stop the economic problems that Japan were facing. So let's go a little bit more in depth. Okay, so what is this rural-urban divide? It comes up sometimes in an essay later on, you take a look. Okay, so while Japan prospered, okay, they also struggled. Like I said, there was a lot of inflation, and you can see that the price of rice increased to almost 174%, and rice was staple, was a basic necessity for all Japanese, in fact. Okay, now the challenges was, because this was happening, it got worse in the countryside. Productivity of the farmers, insufficient land because of the large population. Now, some of these farmers, they are actually rental. Tenant is just they borrow the land. And the tenant farmers would pay the landowners to rent. But much of the harvest were not given to the person who actually work on the land. And it was really, really bad. So you can imagine all the unhappiness of these farmers who worked so hard, but they had to give it up, right? Now, it made it worse when you could see that the government was supporting the wealthy Zaibatsus. Who were the Zaibatsus? They were actually very large businesses. So you had your your Mitsubishi, your Nissan, okay, in the hands of not bang, right, big business. Well, the peasants continued to live in poverty, and the richest landlords were not working on the farm, but they were merely using the tenants or the farmers, I would say, hard work. Now, the divide between the rich and the poor literally led to angry workers, and it made them question the civilian government. So if there is no civilian government, then the people would then have to put their support to, later on you see, the military. Now, next is, of course, you sense this changing role of women. A lot of women were now more independent, they were working, and some of them were even active in politics. But this was a sore thumb to society because they felt that it was an erosion of traditional Japanese society. And they were very much traditional, and they were inclined to support groups that will help to preserve and return to traditional values. And you will see that it is not the civilian or the parliamentary or the democratic government. Later on, it will be the military who will champion the fact that the woman's role is still within the family. Now, the banking crisis of 1927 worsens the economic challenge that Japan was facing. Really very much because in the 1920s, like I said, a lot of economic challenges were present, not only in Japan, but also externally. Okay. And it was very hard because the Japanese were giving a lot of loan, and a lot of this business borrowed a lot of money, and once they couldn't pay, banks closed. And when banks closed down, many people would try to withdraw their deposits, and it led into a financial crisis. Okay, again, because of that, when the Japanese were looking at the government, specifically the civilian government, it felt that the government couldn't solve their economic problems, and the issue of corruption was there, the issue of them favoring only the rich was there. So these were things that made the population upset. Now, of course, like I said, and how Wall Street crash affected both Germany, it also affected Japan equally. And remember, Japan was not spared. And as the world gets more, I would say, protectionist, protecting their own country, they were not buying Japan's exports. And because of that, Japan's economy was very stagnant. There was nothing that Japan could sell to the world. Okay, it impacted farmers because none of the exports were able to sell. That means anything, nothing, no countries were buying anything, any products from anywhere. Impact on small businesses, okay, and on the general public. All right, all these things. And of course, the rise of communism. And many communists criticized the state and even call for a revolution. So you can see that all this led to protests and unhappiness towards the civilian government. So the effects of Great Depression, the effects of all this inability to protect civilians, many became very distrustful of the government and withdrew their support. Okay, now sentiments also provoke radical new approaches that will help overcome the economic problems. Now, who then is this ultranationalist, and what's the impact All right, how did this lead to the rise of militarism in Japan? Now, when we talk about the appeal of ultranationalists, we're looking at three aspects. We're looking at the discontentment from military, how the military rose and influenced, and the growing opposition to civilian government. So, while the military seems to be independent of what the government is doing, the military is also affected. Okay, there was a lot of um, issues between the military and the civilian government because the civilian government would cut all this military budget, and it made the army and navy very upset about that. Okay, there was also discontentment that is based on overseas. Okay, so things like the Washington Naval Conference, where Japan was forced to reduce its naval strength after World War One, but then Japan realized that, hey, why am I reducing my naval strength lesser than USA and Britain? So there was this unfavorable terms, and the Japanese government was not ready to confront the Western power, so they just signed it. Okay, and the Navy saw it as a betrayal by the civilian government. The other thing was also, after Japan won in the Russo-Japanese War, so Manchuria was sort of like given to Japan, right? And in 1906, the Kwangtung Japanese Army was created, right? And initially, the Manchurian warlord, because they were working very closely, had very good relationship, but it deteriorated, it worsened, I guess, causing a lot of frustration among the army, and the army assassinated him. Okay, now the emperor was unhappy, and the emperor wanted the prime minister to punish the Japanese military, but the prime minister was weak, and you could see from this action, it was the military was clearly defiant, and from this, it actually showed that the military was very independent and no one at that time could stop the military. They seemed to have their own influence. They seemed to run by themselves and no one could stop them. All right, so this is the one. Okay, and this is the Kwangtung Army in Manchuria. Okay, now it does not help that the military became more popular as people were very upset and they felt that the civilian government was not good enough. The military seems to be the one that is getting a lot of support. There was a lot of victories, things like the Mukden incident, memories from the Russo-Jap War, the Sino-Jap War. So all that sort of made the Japanese military more popular than the civilian government. Okay. So it does make a difference. Okay, a weak civilian government versus what we call a stronger military, and they saw because of the success in Manchuria, and Manchuria was like, if all this economic problem, Manchuria maybe was the alternative, and the people were supporting blatantly the Japanese military. And that made the military even more popular than they are already, right? So all of this. So what was next? It was definitely the growing opposition to the civilian government. All right. What is ultranationalism? Is an extreme form of nationalism, very highly extreme, and a lot of it was because of they felt the unjust that they were suffering, all right, whether they were a military, whether they were civilians. And they came up with groups. These are some of the groups. Good to know one or two, all right? And most of these groups aim to remove the democratic groups and restore direct rule to emperor. So they're still very loyal to the emperor, don't get me wrong, but they want to get rid of the civilian government as well as the prime minister. Now, because they do that, they needed to kill or assassinate some of these civilian political leaders. And there were many attempts. There was the November 1930, February 1932, March 1932, and the biggest one was 15 May 1932. Okay, that was really trying to overthrow um, the democratic government, the Zaibatsus, okay, but the coup failed. However, the military commanders did not condemn the coup. Instead, they said that there must be political reforms. And because of that, the civilian government, the Seiyukai party, was prevented from forming a cabinet, and the emperor appointed a navy admiral as Japan's new prime minister. Okay, so now the cabinet consists of 15 members, 10 military, 5 civilian representatives. So you could see that the civilian government seems to be now losing a lot of power. Okay, the ultranationalists here. So these are the different groups of the ultranationalists, and they were the ones who were trying to change society, and it doesn't help that they do get the support of the people. So what's the impact then? So now you have a society that is very pro-military. You have a very weak democratic government. You have a very weak prime minister, and you have an emperor that not really so powerful, trying to, but can't do much right now. So impact, okay? Political consolidation, economic impact, as well as social impact. Now, in political consolidation, you could see that once the military was in power, these were the things that they did. Okay, so first things first is they increased influence. All right, they took positions in civil service. By right, they shouldn't, right? Okay, they should only send representatives to ensure that they are ministers of, ministers of war, or those kind of things. Increased support due to military success. They even came out with campaign aimed to remove corrupt practices. But what they wanted to do was actually just to get rid of whoever was against them, inclusive of communism. It was definitely easy once they are in power. It allowed the military to consolidate and influenced the government, and they were able to win the support from the public. Okay, and it feels as though voting was not necessary because the military was that strong. Now you also have this, which is called the military, however, was being divided into two. So don't get me wrong, the military, while they are united as a friend, they can also have their own issues. So they're being divided into two: imperial wave faction and control faction. Okay, so there are two different generals leading this, but they're both military. All right. Now, the imperial wave faction believed that Japan should put less emphasis on modernizing, and they wanted to spend or go back to very traditional ways like honor, loyalty, obedience. They wanted to be directly ruled by the emperor, free from a corrupt government. Very good. Okay. But the military coup that happened previously, remember, but failed, was mostly led by the imperial wave faction. And loosed influence within the army and provided opportunity for the control faction to rise to power. Now, the control faction was more aggressive, I would say. They were ready for war with the West. They felt that Japan shouldn't be avoiding the West anymore. They believed in collaborating with, sorry, spelling error here, heads of the Zaibatsu and give them the control of key industry sectors. So they really believe in using the economic power that the Zaibatsus had. And because of that, okay, the military had so much influence. Now they could appoint a general as minister of war. Now the control faction took up most of the military, and that's it. That was one of the many reasons why later on you'll see that Japan was much more deliberated in going to war, because the faction, the groups in the Japanese military was very much led by the control faction, which was more aggressive. Now, the civilians, politicians, what happened to them? Totally, I wouldn't say totally gone, but it was really, really affected. Okay. Consequently, all right, the Japanese supported the military officers, and the prince Fubimaru was appointed, and he was very much pro-military, and he allowed the army to lead an invasion into China, which was the second Sino-Jap War. All right. In October 1937, he permitted the formation of a cabinet planning office that was basically the military offices. Japan's financial minister was also now controlled by a military officer. And of course, the guy that sort of envisioned Japan's military invasion into Southeast Asia, General Tojo Hideki, took over the role of prime minister. So once you have a minister that is an army general, you obviously have a country that is not only pro-war, but pro-aggression and pro-military. Okay? So economic consolidation, well, now you realize that everything about Japan was very much military. Okay. How about economic impact? All right. So, of course, there was an increase in government control because they need to make sure that economically Japan continued to be strong. And when Japan is strong, then Japan can be more powerful, contribute to the military. Campaign for economic revitalization. So, what's that? Okay, so there was a lot of government control over industries. There was a lot of heavy emphasis on industrial efforts. Just like Germany, there was a lot of big construction projects to reduce unemployment. There was the rise of new Zaibatsus. Why are new Zaibatsus? Because they worked very closely with the Japanese military, unlike the previous Zaibatsus, right? They were working very closely with the democratic government. The positive impact is really there was reduced unemployment, there was increase in standard of living, and there was this build up of national sentiments and pride among the Japanese. However, because they were prepping for war, right, there was very little spent on consumer goods, and eventually, as the war kicks in, as you know, the industries were really focusing on war materials, it did lead to a lower standard of living for the Japanese. Now, why did the government want to control the industries? Obviously, they wanted to control the Zaibatsus. They didn't want the Zaibatsus to be profit making. They wanted the Zaibatsus to rally together to help the country. So that is why the government passed the Principal Industries Control Law. And they combined Zaibatsus into cartels. They took control over Zaibatsus despite the initial resistance. And indirectly, everything became under military. All right. Positive impact is it prevented Zaibatsus from being profit making, and it helped the Japanese economy. All right. It enhanced Japanese prep for war. But of course, it made the Zaibatsus, those who were businessmen, very bitter that they now no longer have independent control over their big businesses. Trade unions, you know, even though initially they favored trade unions were very much for the workers. It was dissolved, okay, unless it's related to the military. Why? For a reason because trade unions means that there will be opposition or there will be question or critics towards the Japanese government, which at this time already was the military government. Right now, positive impact when you control trade unions, just like how Germany is, there will be stability, there will be productivity. Everybody is working for the same goal, but it meant the lack of rights for workers. There was no negotiation. And it also risked the military later on to lose its popularity because then people realized that, oh, it's actually quite bad to be under the Japanese military rule. Now, what is this economic revitalization? So they wanted to involve the farmers because they do know that the countryside was one of the many reasons why the democratic government lost its popularity, right? Because they were not looking after the welfare of the farmers. So they came out with this campaign, okay, encourage farmers to use farming methods, more modern farming methods to make better crops. So you had success stories. It is good. Okay, it does increase efficiency. It does try to reduce the rural-urban divide, and it made the farmers support the military rule. However, not really, because at the end of the day, Japan, under a military government, was looking forward for war. So the things that they are investing on produces for war. So what makes you think that they would actually focus on farmers, right? So then by the time the farmers realized that, it was a bit too late already, there's just so many laws to prevent them from rebelling. Now, social impact, okay? For you to have a full military government, you definitely need to have two things: education as well as censorship. So once the Japanese military was in power, these two things were very much needed. Okay, so one of the things is through the young minds. Of course, there was already importance towards the emperor, loyalty, but they wanted to strengthen the control of the youths, the younger population through education. So there was a document, okay, it is called this Kokutai no Hongi, which was fundamentals of a national policy. It was given to educators, it was given as part of curriculum, and there was a lot of military style drilling. Very familiar to Germany, right? Now, positive impact, of course, the indoctrination since young, okay, the sense of pride. That's why you have all these very young Japanese who are willing to fight for Japan later on when they go to war, right? Now, because of that, it was very much a very brainwashed society. Censorship was definitely there, okay? The media was very focusing on the strong spirit. The media was focusing on what is expected, the roles of the Japanese. There was a lot of censorship. There was a propaganda committee. There was also the special police force, just like what we had during the Japanese occupation. The Kampatai, okay, was set up to ensure that people were to conform. And if you don't conform, then unfortunately you will have to be you would have to be abused, or sent somewhere else. Now, positive impacts of this is definitely you would actually control public opinion, a rise of Japanese nationalist sentiment, but of course there was lack of freedom, and people who were against the Japanese military had to suffer. All right, so we have finally end this. I do want to share with you. So how does it look like if, let's say, it is an essay? So give me a minute. Let me just show you certain aspect. Okay. In the tiny URL that is given to you, there is actually just let me. Okay, so in the tiny URL, there is a set of notes. Okay, I'll make some edits because of the errors, but I want you to look all the way at this page, page 21. Okay, these are possible questions that they're going to ask. So again, they can only ask about the reasons for the rise as well as the impact. So basically, it's just two very broad essay. Okay, and there are some examples here from other schools that you can see. And then after that, when we come to revision time, you can ask your teachers for any concerns that you may have. All right, but take a look. These are the possible questions that they can ask you on Chapter 3, Japan Militarism. Okay, so remember two aspects of it, okay? Rise, or the reasons for the rise, as well as what is the impact of Japanese militarist rule. All right, so good luck on your revision. Bye-bye.